A rusted sedan swayed against the frozen pine branches, suspended over nothing but 100 feet of empty air. Inside, two figures pressed close, an old man shielding his wife with borrowed warmth he no longer had to give. The metal groaned with each gust of wind, straining against the ice-covered trees that held it by threads and miracles. Miles above on the mountain pass, a retired SEAL drove through the whiteout, knuckles white on the wheel, seeking escape in the storm. Beside him, his Belgian Malinois sat rigid in the passenger seat, nostrils flaring, amber eyes locked on something invisible in the blizzard. When that low, trained whine cut through the silence, the sound that had saved a dozen lives in war zones, what Marcus found wasn't just two strangers frozen in time. It was proof that service never ends, that loyalty speaks louder than snow, and that sometimes God doesn't send rescue from the valley below. He sends it from a soldier who thought he'd left saving lives behind. The slope was a sheet of glass, but Koda moved like smoke over the drifts. The dog reached the hanging car first, his weight surprisingly steadying the teetering metal. Inside, Elias, 84 years old, looked up. His skin was pale blue, his hands frozen around his wife, Clara. He didn't look at the dog with fear. He looked at him with relief. When Marcus reached the door, the laws of physics made a terrifying sound. The pine tree holding the rear axle snapped a branch. The car dipped. Gravity was demanding its due. Marcus knew the math. The car could hold the weight of the couple or the weight of the rescuer, but not both. He shattered the rear window. But the old man, Elias, didn't move to save himself. With shaking hands, he pushed his wife toward the opening. He whispered 3 words that cut through the wind louder than any scream. "Take her first." It took every ounce of strength Marcus had left to drag Elias from the wreck. Seconds later, the pine tree gave way. The sedan plummeted into the white abyss below, a silent crash swallowed by the storm. Safe inside the truck, the adrenaline faded, replaced by a question that haunted the silence. Why drive into a historic blizzard? Why risk 60 years of love on a mountain road that even the locals avoided? Elias pulled a photograph from his frozen coat pocket. It wasn't of a scenic view. It was a young man in uniform. "Today is his birthday," Elias whispered. "Our boy. He died in Afghanistan 20 years ago. We've visited his memorial on this peak every year since. I knew the storm was coming, but I couldn't bear the thought of him spending his birthday alone in the cold." The cab went silent. Marcus looked at the young face in the photo, then at the old man who was willing to die just to be close to his son's memory. Marcus reached into his glove box and pulled out his own trident pin, the symbol of his brotherhood. He placed the metal in the old man's palm. Marcus's voice cracked, the armor of the warrior finally breaking to reveal the human underneath. "Sir," he said, "your son wasn't alone today, and neither were you. We take care of our own. They say luck is when preparation meets opportunity." But looking at the tracks in the snow, where a soldier, a dog, and a grieving couple crossed paths at the exact second needed to cheat death, you realize it wasn't luck at all. It was an appointment, kept by a guardian who thought he was just going for a drive, and orchestrated by a God who knows that sometimes the only way to heal a broken heart is to ask it to beat for someone else. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Marcus's foot hovered over the gas pedal. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, to let the storm swallow whatever Koda had detected and carry on into the white oblivion where memories couldn't follow. But his hand was already easing off the throttle, the truck slowing to a crawl. 6 years. That's how long he and Koda had been together. 6 years of sand and blood, of midnight extractions and dawn patrols, of moments where the difference between life and death came down to the dog's nose twitching half a second before the IED detonated. Koda had never been wrong. Not in Kandahar. Not in Helmand province. Not once. The whine came again, sharper this time, urgent. Koda's paw scraped against the passenger window, claws leaving faint marks on the frost. Marcus exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cab despite the heater running full blast. "All right, boy," he muttered. "Show me." He guided the truck to the shoulder, or what he thought was the shoulder. The road and the wilderness had become indistinguishable under 2 feet of fresh powder. The moment he killed the engine, the silence hit him like a physical force. No traffic. No distant hum of civilization. Just wind howling through the mountain pass like the ghost of every brother he'd left behind. Marcus popped the door and stepped into knee-deep snow. The cold bit through his thermal layers instantly, sharp and merciless. He moved to the rear of the truck, muscle memory taking over as he pulled out his gear bag. Rope, harness, carabiners. The medical kit he'd restocked 3 weeks ago but never expected to use. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, checking knots he could tie blindfolded, testing clips that had held his weight on a dozen rappels down hostile cliffs. Koda bounded out behind him, immediately pressing his nose to the snow, sweeping left and right in the methodical search pattern they drilled 1,000 times. The Malinois moved like liquid shadow, powerful and precise, his dark coat barely visible against the storm. Marcus attached the tracking harness to Koda's chest, the familiar click of the buckle somehow louder than the wind. "Find," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the edge of authority that Koda responded to better than any treat. The dog surged forward, and Marcus followed, leaning into the gale. They hadn't gone 20 yards when Marcus saw it. A break in the snow's uniformity. Tire tracks, recent enough that the storm hadn't completely filled them. They cut across the road at an angle that made his stomach drop. No one drives like that unless they're skidding, losing control, fighting physics, and losing. The tracks led straight toward the cliff edge. Adrenaline flooded his system, sharp and familiar. His vision narrowed. His breathing slowed. The storm faded to background noise as his combat mind took over, assessing, calculating, preparing for what came next. He'd felt this way approaching hostile compounds in the dark, when every sense sharpened to razor focus and time stretched into something malleable. Koda reached the edge first and stopped, his entire body going rigid. That was the signal Marcus had been dreading. Not a false alarm. Not an animal or a thermal vent or any of the 100 things that could trigger a dog's interest. This was the real thing. Someone was down there. Marcus dropped to his knees at the precipice, ignoring the ice soaking through his pants. He pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam over the edge. For a moment, he saw only swirling white and the dark suggestion of trees far below. Then the wind shifted, and his light caught something that shouldn't exist. A car. A sedan. Rusted red paint barely visible under snow and ice. It was hanging, literally hanging, from a cluster of pine trees about 40 feet down the slope. The vehicle was wedged at an angle, its front end pointing toward the sky, rear tires dangling over nothing. The trees supporting it were bent nearly horizontal, their trunks groaning with every gust of wind. As Marcus watched, frozen in a moment of pure disbelief, the car shifted. Just an inch. Just enough to make the pines creak and the snow shake loose from their branches. Jesus Marcus breated. Through the frosted back window he saw movement. Small, weak, but movement nonetheless. His mind raced through calculations he'd made 100 times in theater. Angle of descent, anchor points, weight distribution, extraction time. He had maybe an hour before that car plunged into the ravine. Less if the wind picked up. And if there were people inside, injured, hypothermic, they had even less time than that. Koda whined again, softer now, almost questioning. The dog looked at Marcus with those amber eyes that had watched him break down in a medical tent after they'd pulled Roar's tags from the rubble. Eyes that had seen Marcus at his worst and never looked away. Marcus reached out and gripped the thick fur at Koda's neck. "We're going down," he said quietly. Not a question. Not a debate. A statement of fact, the kind of certainty he'd lost somewhere between discharge papers and the long, empty months that followed. He stood, snow cascading off his knees, and moved back to the truck. The wind tore at his jacket as he rigged the anchor system, wrapping rope around the trailer hitch in a figure-8 pattern that would hold 10 times his weight. His hands moved automatically, tying knots his body remembered even when his mind wandered. Behind him, Koda paced the cliff edge, staring down at the hanging sedan like he could will it to stay suspended through sheer force of loyalty. The rope secure, Marcus clipped himself in and gave it 3 hard tugs. Solid. He turned to Koda and pointed down the slope. Easy descent. Stay close. The Malinois didn't hesitate. He started down the icy incline with the confidence of a dog who'd navigated worse terrain under enemy fire. Marcus followed, letting the rope take his weight as his boots searched for purchase on ground that wanted nothing more than to send him tumbling into the void. Halfway down, the wind hit him broadside, strong enough to swing him like a pendulum. The car groaned louder now, the sound of metal and wood engaged in a battle neither could win. Through the rear window, Marcus could see them clearly now, 2 shapes pressed close together. Elderly, fragile, holding each other like the world had already ended and they were just waiting for gravity to make it official. Marcus's jaw tightened. Not today, he thought. Not on my watch. His boots hit the narrow ledge beside the vehicle, and Koda was already there, pressed against the driver's side door, his body heat melting the frost in small circles. Marcus moved carefully, testing each step, painfully aware that one wrong shift in weight could tip the balance. He reached the rear passenger window and wiped away the ice with his glove. 2 faces stared back at him through the glass. An old man, maybe mid-80s, with hollow cheeks and ice in his beard. Beside him, a woman with silver hair and blue lips, her hand clutched in his. For a moment, nobody moved. The old man's eyes went wide, like he was seeing a ghost, or an angel, or something his frozen mind couldn't quite process. Marcus tapped the glass. "I'm getting you out," he said, loud enough to cut through the wind. "Both of you, stay calm." The woman's lips moved, forming words Marcus couldn't hear. But he didn't need to. He'd seen that look before, in villages under siege, in bunkers taking mortar fire. It was the look of people who'd stopped believing in rescue. Until rescue showed up anyway. Koda pressed closer to the car, and Marcus felt it. That shift in purpose, that old familiar certainty. This was why they were here. This was the mission. And God help anyone or anything that tried to stop them. The slope was worse than Marcus had calculated. From the road, it had looked like a 40-degree incline. Down here, with ice coating every surface and the wind trying to peel him off the mountain like old paint, it felt closer to vertical. He pressed his back against the frozen rock face, assessing the geometry of the situation with the cold precision that came from years of planning operations where one miscalculation meant body bags. The sedan hung at a 20-degree angle, nose up, tail down. 3 pine trees held it, 2 supporting the undercarriage, 1 wedged under the rear axle. The trees were old growth, thick as a man's torso, but they were bending. Not breaking yet, but the groan of wood fiber under impossible strain was constant. A low moan beneath the wind's howl. Every gust made the vehicle rock, and every rock made those trees bend a little more. Marcus needed intel. He needed to know if the occupants were conscious, if they could move, if there were injuries that would complicate extraction. But the slope between his position and the driver's side door was a death trap. Sheet ice over loose scree, with nothing to arrest a fall except a 100-foot drop into darkness. He couldn't go down there. Not yet. Not without better anchors, better angles, better odds. But Koda could. Marcus looked at the Malinois, who sat at perfect attention beside him, snow gathering on his dark coat. The dog's eyes were locked on the sedan, his breathing steady despite the altitude and cold. This was what Koda had been bred for, trained for, lived for, navigating impossible terrain to reach people who needed reaching. "Koda," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the wind with command authority. The dog's ears swiveled forward. "Find them. Easy." The word easy was critical. It meant careful approach, slow movement, assess before engaging. It was the difference between a dog who charged into situations and a dog who survived them. Koda knew the difference. Had proven it in a dozen combat zones where aggressive could get you killed and careful kept you breathing. The Malinois moved like water flowing downhill, finding paths Marcus's eyes couldn't track. His claws found purchase in ice that looked smooth as glass. His weight distributed across 4 points of contact instead of 2, giving him stability no human could match. He traversed the slope in a zigzag pattern, testing each step before committing, the same way he'd crossed mine-scattered roads in Helmand. Marcus watched with a mixture of pride and terror he'd never admit to. Koda was more than a dog, more than a partner. He was the last piece of Marcus's soul that still knew how to trust, how to love without condition, how to show up when called. Watching him navigate that killing slope felt like watching his own heart walk a tightrope. Koda reached the sedan's front end, where it angled upward into the gray sky. The hood was the most stable platform, directly over the support points where the trees bore the weight. The dog planted his front paws on the crumpled metal and pulled himself up with the powerful hindquarters that had dragged wounded soldiers out of ambush zones. For a moment, Koda stood perfectly still on the hood, surveying his position like a general on a battlefield. Then he moved forward, toward the windshield. Inside the car, Marcus saw movement. The old man's head turned. Through the frosted glass, Marcus watched the man's face transform, confusion giving way to fear, because what the old man saw wasn't a rescue. It was a 70-pound Belgian Malinois with a face full of teeth, eyes like liquid gold, and the intensity of a predator who just found prey. The woman clutched her husband tighter. Even from 40 feet away, Marcus could see them trembling. Not just from cold now, from primal, instinctive terror. "Easy," Marcus whispered, though Koda couldn't possibly hear him. "Show them easy." And Koda did something that made Marcus's throat tighten. The dog lowered his body flat against the hood, reducing his profile, making himself smaller, less threatening. His ears, which had been forward and alert, softened back. Not in aggression, but in the universal canine language of gentleness. Then Koda stretched his neck forward and pressed his nose against the frosted windshield. His tongue, pink and warm, licked the glass. The sound cut through even the wind. A slow, wet rasp that cleared a small circle in the frost. Through that circle, the old couple could see Koda's eyes. Not predator eyes now. Guardian eyes. Koda let out a sound Marcus had only heard a handful of times in 6 years. Not a bark. Not a whine. A soft, low woof that somehow contained comfort and promise and protection all at once. The old man's fear didn't vanish. Fear that deep didn't vanish, but it shifted. Marcus saw the moment it happened, saw the man's hand come up and press against the glass from inside, mirroring where Koda's nose touched from outside. One warm palm, one cold nose. Connection across glass and ice and species. The car shifted again, groaning. One of the trees cracked, not breaking but warning it might. Koda's body tensed, ready to leap clear if the vehicle went. But he didn't move, didn't leave his post. Instead, he settled more firmly onto the hood, distributing his weight like an extra anchor point, like he could hold the sedan in place through sheer determination. And remarkably, impossibly, the car's rocking slowed. Maybe it was Koda's 70 pounds finding the center of balance. Maybe it was the trees finally settling into their burden. Or maybe it was something Marcus didn't have words for, something about loyalty and presence and refusing to let go. The old woman was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks. But she was smiling, too. Her free hand joined her husband's against the glass. Both of them touching the circle Koda had cleared, like they could feel the dog's warmth through the barrier. Koda's tail moved once, twice. Not a wag of excitement, a slow sweep of acknowledgement. "I see you. I'm here. I'm not leaving." Marcus's chest felt tight. He'd trained Koda to detect explosives, to track insurgents, to alert on threats and protect flanks and be a weapon when weapons were needed. But nobody had trained Koda for this instinct to recognize fear and answer it with gentleness. Nobody taught a dog to understand that sometimes the bravest thing isn't aggression, but patience. That sometimes what people need isn't to be saved from danger, but to know they're not facing it alone. Marcus pulled his radio, hoping against hope the storm hadn't killed all signals. Static answered him. He tried again. More static. They were on their own, just like he'd known they would be. "Good boy," Marcus called down, his voice barely carrying. "Hold position." Koda's ears twitched, the only sign he'd heard. He stayed exactly where he was, pressed against the windshield, a guardian carved from muscle and devotion and something deeper than training could touch. Marcus turned back to his rope system, his mind already racing through the extraction sequence. He had minutes, maybe less, but those minutes mattered because Koda had bought them, had traded fear for trust, chaos for calm, and given Marcus the one thing he needed most: time. The wind howled, the car groaned, and on the hood of a sedan hanging by threads and miracles, a dog kept watch over two souls who'd forgotten what hope looked like, until hope showed up with 4 legs and a heart too big to let them fall alone. Marcus moved with the controlled urgency of a man who'd spent years balancing speed against survival. The slope down to the sedan was a nightmare of ice and loose rock, but he'd rappelled down worse: cliff faces in Hindu Kush, building facades under mortar fire, burning oil platforms where every second meant the difference between extraction and explosion. This was just another vertical problem with a ticking clock attached. He clipped a second line to the nearest stable outcropping and tested it with his full weight. It held. Working on 2 anchor points now, he could triangulate his approach, keep the angles favorable, avoid putting lateral stress on the car. The mathematics of it came automatically, years of training compressed into instinct. The rear door was his best access point. The front was too close to where the trees bore the weight. Any disturbance there could shift the balance. Marcus reached the door handle and pulled. Locked. Of course it was locked. People locked their doors out of habit even when plunging off cliffs. He pulled his tactical knife and wedged it into the seal, working the lock mechanism with the kind of patience that felt like violence against time. The lock popped with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the frozen air. The door swung open, and the smell hit him immediately. Old upholstery, stale coffee, and beneath it all, the copper tang of blood and the deeper, more primal scent of hypothermia. Like meat left too long in a freezer. "Sir, ma'am," Marcus said, keeping his voice level, professional. "My name's Marcus. I'm getting you both out. I need you to stay still and let me work." The old man turned his head slowly, like his neck had frozen solid. His eyes struggled to focus. Up close, Marcus could see the damage the cold had done. Skin the color of old newspaper, lips tinged blue-gray, ice crystals in his beard. But what hit Marcus hardest was the man's jacket. He wasn't wearing one. His button-down shirt was soaked through with snowmelt, plastered to a frame that was nothing but bone and will. Beside him, wrapped in what looked like 3 coats and 2 blankets, the woman shivered violently. Her eyes were clearer, more present, but her hands shook so badly she couldn't have held a cup if her life depended on it. Which, Marcus realized with cold clarity, it did. The old man had given her everything, every layer, every chance. He'd chosen her life over his with the kind of quiet certainty that came from 60 years of making the same choice over and over until it became identity. Marcus did the math in his head. The man had maybe 20 minutes before his core temperature dropped below recovery. The woman had longer, but not much. And Marcus needed both hands free to work the extraction, cutting seatbelts, stabilizing necks, checking for spinal injuries, rigging the harness system that would get them up the slope. He couldn't warm them and save them at the same time. But Koda could. Marcus leaned back, found Koda still positioned on the hood. "Koda, heat, now." The command was different from find or easy. Heat was a K-9 medical protocol they drilled during cold weather training. It meant provide body warmth to casualties, maintain contact, prevent shock. Koda had done it twice in theater. Once for a Marine who'd been pulled from a frozen river. Once for a local kid caught in crossfire during a winter patrol. The dog moved without hesitation, sliding off the hood and through the open rear door in one fluid motion. The sedan rocked with the shift in weight, and Marcus's hand shot out to brace against the roof, muscles tensed, ready to grab both occupants if the whole thing went. The trees groaned. The car settled, held. Koda wedged himself into the footwell behind the front seats, then stretched his heavy, muscular body across the old couple's legs. 70 pounds of Belgian Malinois, built like coiled wire and heated by a metabolism that ran 10 degrees hotter than human. The dog's weight pressed down, and Marcus could see the immediate effect. The violent shivering in the woman's legs slowed. The old man's foot twitched, responding to warmth it had forgotten existed. "Good boy," Marcus murmured. Then to the couple, "That's Koda. He's gonna keep you warm while I work. Don't be scared of him. The woman's hand dropped to Koda's head, fingers burying into his thick coat with the desperation of someone grabbing a lifeline. Thank you, she whispered, her voice like paper tearing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Marcus pulled his medical kit and went to work. Seatbelt first, the old man's was twisted, frozen, the release mechanism jammed. Marcus cut through it with his knife, one hand supporting the man's weight, so he wouldn't slump forward when the tension released. The blade bit through the fabric, and the man sagged into Marcus's grip. I've got you, sir, Marcus said. What's your name? Elias. The word came out slurred, slow. Wife, Clara. Elias, I need you to stay awake. Can you do that for me? Elias's eyes drifted. Marcus gripped his shoulder, firm enough to hurt, enough to cut through the hypothermic fog. Elias, eyes on me. That's an order. The word order did something. Elias's gaze sharpened slightly, and Marcus saw it. The ghost of military training, decades old but still there, buried under age and cold. The man straightened slightly, some deep part of him responding to command voice the way Marcus knew it would. That's it, Marcus said. Stay with me. He moved to Clara, checking her pulse, her pupils, the color of her nail beds under the layers of gloves. Hypothermic but stable. Better than her husband by a factor of 10. Clara, can you move your toes? She nodded. I think so. I can't feel them, but I think they're moving. Good enough. I'm gonna get you both into a harness. Then we're going up. It's gonna be cold and scary, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Clara looked at him with eyes that had seen wars and presidents and grandchildren and loss, eyes that had earned the right to doubt every promise. But what she said was, yes. Marcus pulled the double harness from his pack, designed for tandem extractions, rated for 500 pounds. He worked quickly, threading straps around Elias first, checking connections twice because there were no do-overs at 40 feet. Then Clara, securing her against her husband so they'd ascend together, the way they'd probably done everything for 60 years. The car shifted again. A louder groan this time, wood fiber beginning to splinter. One of the support trees was giving up the fight. We're out of time, Marcus said, more to himself than them. He looped the primary line through their harness and clipped it to his own. They'd ascend together, all of them, one unit. If the car went, it wouldn't take any of them with it. He looked at Koda, still pressed against their legs, providing warmth that bought seconds, minutes, life. Koda, release. Up. The dog pulled back immediately, transitioning from heater to scout, scrambling up the slope ahead of them to clear the path, test the footing, be the early warning system he'd always been. Marcus gripped the rope and began to pull. The harness went taut. Elias and Clara rose from the seat, suspended between Marcus's strength and the anchor point above. The sedan rocked violently without their weight, and one of the trees snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The car dropped 6 inches, caught by the remaining trees, then hung there, screaming. Marcus didn't look back. He pulled hand over hand, boots finding purchase, dragging 2 lives up a mountain 1 foot at a time. Above him, Koda barked once, clear path, keep moving. Behind him, the car groaned its final warning. And between them, wrapped in rope and trust and each other, 2 people who'd driven into a storm for love found themselves lifted out of it by the same. The climb was hell given form and ice. Marcus's arms burned with the kind of fire that came from asking muscles to do more than physics should allow. Every pull on the rope dragged Elias and Clara another foot higher, and every foot felt like it cost a year of his life. The harness straps cut into his shoulders through his tactical vest, redistributing weight that wanted nothing more than to drag all 3 of them back down into the ravine. Clara whispered prayers into Elias's shoulder, her voice so soft Marcus only caught fragments. Hail Mary and deliver us, and words that might have been names. Children, maybe, or grandchildren, the people waiting for them on the other side of this mountain if they could just hold on long enough. Elias was silent, not unconscious. Marcus could see his chest moving, could feel the faint tension in the harness that meant the old man was trying to help, trying to use what little strength remained to take some of his own weight. It wasn't much. Maybe it was nothing. But the fact that he was trying, even now, even like this, said everything about the kind of man he'd been before the cold tried to steal him away. 20 feet from the top, Marcus's boot slipped. His knee slammed into rock, pain exploding white-hot through the joint. He caught himself on the rope, muscles screaming, the harness biting deeper into his shoulders. For one terrible second, they swung, Marcus, Elias, Clara, all suspended over nothing but gravity's patient hunger. Marcus! Clara's voice cracked with terror. I've got you! He grunted through gritted teeth. I've got you! But the truth was closer than comfort. He was running out of strength. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the initial extraction was fading, leaving only the raw mathematics of exhaustion and angles and weight. He was strong, SEAL training had made sure of that, but he wasn't superhuman. And right now, he needed to be. Above him, Koda barked. Not the alert bark or the warning bark. This was different.
Urgent.
Insistent. The sound a dog makes when he knows something his human doesn't. Marcus looked up through the snow and gray, and his breath caught. Koda wasn't alone anymore. The Malinois stood at the cliff edge beside a figure Marcus's exhausted brain took too long to process. A woman. Young, late 20s maybe, wearing a ranger's jacket and a radio clipped to her shoulder. Her face was pale with shock, brown hair whipping around her face, but her hands were already reaching for the rope. Pull! She shouted down. I've got secondary line. Marcus didn't question it, didn't have the breath or the time. He just pulled, and the woman pulled, and together they dragged Elias and Clara up that last impossible stretch of mountain. The old couple crested the edge, and the woman grabbed them, easing them onto solid ground with practiced efficiency. Marcus hauled himself up last, every muscle trembling, his injured knee threatening to buckle. He collapsed onto his back in the snow, chest heaving, vision swimming. Who? He managed. Sarah. Forest Ranger. The woman was already checking Clara's pulse, her pupils, moving with the kind of calm competence that only came from training. I was doing road checks when I saw your truck. Came to investigate and saw. She trailed off, looking at the cliff edge where the sedan had been. Past tense. Had been. Marcus rolled onto his side and looked down. The car was gone. The trees that had held it were bent but empty, a few broken branches marking where the miracle had run out. Far below, barely visible through the storm, a splash of red metal lay crumpled against rocks that would have killed everyone inside it. They'd made it out with maybe 30 seconds to spare.
Jesus, sarabriated.
You pulled them out of that. Marcus didn't answer. He was looking at Elias and Clara, who lay side by side in the snow, still holding hands, still together. Clara was crying, big, gasping sobs of relief and terror and gratitude all tangled together. Elias's eyes were closed, but his lips were moving, praying or cursing or simply counting breaths. Marcus couldn't tell. Koda padded over and lay down beside them, pressing his warm body against Clara's side. She reached out with her free hand and buried her fingers in his fur, and Marcus heard her whisper, "Good boy. Such a good boy." Sarah pulled emergency blankets from her pack, the same foil-looking things Marcus carried, and wrapped them tight around the couple. "We need to get them down to my truck. There's a medical station 20 minutes south if the roads are clear." "Elias first," Marcus said, forcing himself to stand. His knee buckled, and Sarah caught his arm. "You're hurt. I'm fine." It was a lie, but it was the lie soldiers told when people needed them upright. "Help me get him to your vehicle." They worked together, Sarah supporting Elias while Marcus took Clara, who weighed almost nothing, bird bones and will and not much else. Koda walked ahead, clearing the path, testing the snow depth with his paws the way he'd tested roads for pressure plates in Iraq. The ranger's truck was a four-wheel drive beast with chains on the tires and enough emergency equipment in the back to run a small field hospital. They got Elias and Clara into the back seat, cranked the heat to maximum, and wrapped them in every blanket Sarah had. Marcus stood outside, leaning against the truck, trying to get his breathing under control. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash that always followed operations like this. The moment when the body realized it was allowed to feel again and decided to feel everything at once. Sarah handed him a thermos of coffee. He took it without looking at her, holding it between his palms just for the warmth. "You active duty?" she asked. "Retired."
Seal.
He nodded once. "Figures." She looked at Koda, who sat at perfect attention beside Marcus's leg. "That's military working dog posture if I've ever seen it. You two served together. 6 years.
Afghanistan.
Mostly." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the snowfall. Then, "They would have died if you hadn't stopped." Marcus stared at the coffee in his hands. The surface rippled with each tremor in his fingers. "Maybe. Not maybe. Definitely." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough mountain rescues to know the difference between close calls and miracles. "Whatever made you pull over, that saved their lives." Marcus looked at Koda, whose amber eyes looked back with the kind of certainty Marcus had spent 2 years trying to find. "Wasn't me," he said quietly. "It was him." Inside the truck, Clara had started talking, her voice stronger now, telling Sarah about the anniversary, about their son, about why they'd been on this road in a storm that should have kept them home. Marcus listened without meaning to, and every word felt like it was pulling something loose in his chest. Something that had been bolted down tight since the day he'd watched Roar's name get added to a wall of the dead. "He was a Marine," Clara was saying, her voice breaking. "Iraq 2005. We promised him. Before he deployed, we promised we'd visit his memorial every year. We've never missed one. Not once. Even when—" She couldn't finish. Elias's voice, barely audible. "Even when it kills us." Marcus closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw Roar's face, heard his voice, felt the weight of every promise he'd ever made to brothers who didn't make it home. "We take care of our own." The words rose in his throat before he knew they were coming. Inside the truck's cab, the heat was overwhelming after the frozen violence of the mountain. Marcus sat in the passenger seat while Sarah drove, his injured knee throbbing with every heartbeat, his hands still trembling slightly from exhaustion. Behind him, Elias and Clara huddled together under layers of blankets, their breathing gradually evening out as warmth seeped back into bodies that had forgotten what it felt like. Koda lay in the footwell between the front and back seats, his head resting on Clara's lap. She hadn't stopped touching him. One hand buried in his thick coat, fingers working through the fur in slow, rhythmic strokes that seemed to calm her as much as the warmth. Every few seconds, she'd look down at the dog, then at Marcus, then back to the dog, like she couldn't quite believe any of them were real. The shock was setting in now. Marcus recognized it. The 1,000-yard stare, the trembling that had nothing to do with cold, the way Clara's breath kept catching on sobs she couldn't quite release. Elias was worse. His eyes had glazed over, unfocused, his jaw slack. His body was warming, but his mind was still back in that car, still hanging over nothing, still waiting for the fall that had almost come. "Talk to me, Elias," Marcus said, turning in his seat. His voice carried that same command authority that had cut through hypothermic fog on the mountain. "Eyes up here. Stay present." Elias's gaze drifted toward Marcus's voice but didn't quite land. His lips moved soundlessly. Marcus tried again. "Elias, what branch?" That did it. The old man blinked, focused. "What?" "You responded to command voice down there. That's not civilian behavior. What branch did you serve?" A long pause. Then, Army. "Korea. 52 to 54. Combat." "Enough of it." Elias's voice was steadier now, pulled back from wherever it had been drifting. "You?" "Navy. SEALs. Afghanistan, mostly." Elias nodded slowly, and something passed between them, that wordless recognition veterans shared, the knowledge that some experiences didn't need translation. "That dog," he said, looking at Koda. "He's active duty?" "Was. Retired with me 2 years ago. Good dog. The best." Clara's hand tightened in Koda's fur. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "James wanted a dog. Before he deployed. He wrote us letters." She trailed off, tears spilling over. He said if he made it home, first thing he'd do was adopt a military working dog. One of the retired ones. Said they deserved good homes after everything they'd done. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Koda lifted his head, sensing the shift in emotion the way he always did, and nudged Clara's hand with his cold, wet nose. The gesture was so gentle, so perfectly timed, that Clara broke. Really broke. The sobs she'd been holding back finally released in great, gasping waves. But she didn't pull away from Koda. She leaned into him, burying her face in his neck, and the dog held perfectly still. His steady breathing and solid warmth the only anchors in a world that had tried to kill her less than an hour ago. Elias reached over, his shaking hand finding Koda's head, fingers brushing through fur matted with snow and sweat. "Thank you," Elias whispered, not to Marcus, to the dog. "Thank you for staying, for not leaving us." Marcus's throat tightened. He turned back to face forward, staring out at the snow-covered road, unable to watch the raw gratitude on their faces without feeling his own carefully maintained walls beginning to crumble. Sarah glanced at him, said nothing, just kept driving with the practiced ease of someone who'd navigated these mountain passes 1,000 times. Behind him, Clara had stopped crying but hadn't let go of Koda. Her breathing was slower now, matching the rhythm of the dog's steady rise and fall. "He's warm," she murmured. "I didn't think I'd ever be warm again." "That's his job," Marcus said, finding his voice. "Cold weather casualty protocol. He's trained to provide heat and comfort to injured personnel. Did it twice in Afghanistan." "He saved us," Clara said simply. "You both did." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. Instead, he watched the road ahead, counting mile markers, calculating time to medical care, doing the mental mathematics that kept him from thinking about what Clara had said, about James and his letters and his dream of bringing home a dog who'd served alongside him. Koda had served. Koda had sacrificed. Koda had earned his retirement and his peace. But instead of a quiet life, he'd ended up with Marcus. A man who couldn't sit still, who drove into blizzards seeking nothing but distance from memories that followed anyway. And today, that restlessness had put them on this road, at this moment, in position to answer a call that shouldn't have been theirs to answer. Except maybe it was always theirs. "Where were you going?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. "Before all this, you said you were just driving." "Nowhere specific," Marcus admitted. "Just moving. Running," Elias said from the back seat, his voice soft but certain. Marcus stiffened, but the old man continued. "Not judgment. Recognition. I did the same thing after Korea. Couldn't stay still. Felt like if I stopped moving, everything I'd seen would catch up and drown me." Marcus looked back. Elias's eyes were clear now, lucid, holding the weight of decades. "What stopped it?" Marcus asked. "Clara." Elias found his wife's hand, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. "And time. And understanding that running doesn't make the past smaller. It just makes you more tired." The truck hit a bump, and Koda's head came up, alert for a moment before settling back down. Clara's hand never left his coat. "James wrote about that too," she said, her voice distant with memory. "The difficulty coming home. The way the world felt too loud and too quiet at the same time. He said the dogs helped. Said they understood things people couldn't." "They do," Marcus agreed. He reached back, scratching behind Koda's ear. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. "They don't ask questions. Don't need explanations. They just show up. Like you did," Clara said. "For us." Marcus shook his head. "That was Koda. I would have driven past. He's the one who detected you. He's the one who wouldn't let me leave." "But you listened," Elias said. "You trusted him enough to turn around. That's not nothing." The medical station appeared ahead, a small building with lights cutting through the gray afternoon. Sarah pulled into the lot, and almost immediately, paramedics emerged with a wheelchair and gurney. The transition was professional, efficient, vitals checked, blankets replaced, warmth monitored. Elias and Clara were loaded into an ambulance within minutes. But before the doors closed, Clara reached out, grabbing Marcus's sleeve. "Your name," she said urgently. "I need to know your name." "Marcus. Marcus Hayes." "And the dog?" "Koda." Clara held his gaze, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. "Thank you, Marcus Hayes. And thank you, Koda. You gave us more time. More years. More." Her voice broke. "You gave us back to each other." Then the ambulance doors closed, and they were gone, sirens fading into the storm. Marcus stood in the parking lot, snow gathering on his shoulders, Koda pressed against his leg. Sarah appeared beside him with another thermos of coffee. "You did good today," she said. Marcus looked down at Koda, whose amber eyes looked back with that steady, unwavering certainty. "We did what we do. Then what you do matters." The words settled on him like snow. Quiet, persistent, impossible to brush away. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus let himself believe that might be true. 3 days later, Marcus found himself sitting in a hospital waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and weak coffee. He hadn't planned to come back. Hadn't planned to check on them at all. The rescue was done, the mission complete, and in his old life, the military life, that would have been enough. You extracted the targets, got them to safety, filed the report, and moved on to the next operation. Clean. Professional. No attachments beyond the job itself. But this wasn't the military anymore, and something about Elias and Clara had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the way Elias had responded to command voice, that muscle memory of service that transcended age and hypothermia. Maybe it was Clara's tears in Koda's fur, or the story about James and his letters and his dream of bringing home a dog. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just the first time in 2 years Marcus had done something that felt like it mattered, and he didn't want to let go of that feeling yet. Koda sat beside his chair, head resting on Marcus's knee, amber eyes tracking every person who moved through the waiting room. The dog was patient, but Marcus could sense the restlessness beneath the calm exterior. They'd been sitting for 40 minutes, and Koda didn't do sitting well. Neither did Marcus, for that matter. A nurse appeared, clipboard in hand, her expression warm. "Mr. Hayes? They're asking for you." Marcus stood, surprised. "They're awake. For about an hour now. Doing remarkably well, considering." She smiled. "That was quite a rescue. The paramedics said another 30 minutes and they wouldn't have made it." Marcus followed her down a hallway painted in muted blues and grays, Koda's nails clicking softly on the linoleum. They stopped at a room near the end, and through the small window, Marcus could see Elias sitting up in bed, Clara in the chair beside him, both of them looking fragile but alive. The nurse pushed the door open. "You have a visitor." Clara's face lit up the moment she saw them. "Marcus and Koda." She struggled to stand, but Marcus waved her back down. "Don't get up, ma'am. We just wanted to check in. Make sure you're both alive." Elias finished, a wry smile on his weathered face. "Thanks to you, we are." His color was better, still pale, but human pale, not corpse pale. The ice crystals were gone from his beard, and someone had given him a proper hospital gown. He looked smaller in it, older, but his eyes were clear. Marcus stepped into the room, Koda immediately moving to Clara's chair. She reached down without hesitation, her hands finding the familiar thick coat, fingers working through the fur like she'd been doing it for years instead of hours. "I dreamed about him," she said softly. "In the ambulance. Dreamed he was lying across my legs again, keeping me warm." "He has that effect," Marcus said. He pulled up another chair, his injured knee grateful for the chance to rest. "How are you feeling?" "Like we shouldn't be here," Elias said bluntly. "Like we should be frozen solid at the bottom of that ravine." He paused, his hand finding Clara's free one. "We never got to say it proper. In the storm, in the cold, everything was blurred. But now, clear-headed, warm, alive, thank you. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for coming down that mountain. Thank you for not leaving us." Marcus nodded. Uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't know how to receive. Any SEAL would have done the same. "But you're the one who did," Clara said. "You and Koda." She looked down at the dog, her voice thick. "James would have loved him. Would have loved you both. The name hung in the air between them. Marcus had heard it in fragments during the rescue, in the truck. But now, in this quiet room with time and clarity, he needed to understand. Tell me about him, he said. About James. About why you were on that road. Elias and Clara exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of shared everything. Then Elias began. James was our only child. Born in 1983. Wanted to be a Marine from the time he was 12 years old. We tried to talk him out of it. Not because we didn't support the military I'd served, I knew what it meant, but because we knew what it might cost. Elias's voice roughened. He enlisted anyway. 2001, right after September 11th. Said the world needed people willing to stand in the gap. Iraq, 2005. Clara continued when Elias couldn't. His convoy hit an IED outside Fallujah. He was 22 years old. 22 years, 3 months, and 8 days. Her voice didn't break, but only because she'd said these words so many times the edges had worn smooth. They sent us his effects, his medals, his letters, and they told us where they were going to put his memorial plaque. Up on Cedar Ridge, where he used to hike as a boy. Marcus's chest felt tight. 22. Younger than Roar had been. Younger than most of the brothers Marcus had lost. But old enough to wear the uniform, old enough to deploy, old enough to die for something bigger than himself. We promised him, Elias said, 2 days before his deployment. He was scared, wouldn't admit it, but we could see it. And Clara, she told him we'd visit his favorite place every year on his birthday. Every year, no matter what. She said, "You won't be alone, James. We'll make sure you're never alone." February 14th, Clara whispered. Valentine's Day. That's when he was born. And that's when we go to the ridge. Every year for 20 years. We've never missed one. Marcus understood now. The storm, the risk, the impossible choice between safety and promise. They hadn't been foolish old people who didn't understand weather reports. They'd been parents who couldn't break faith with their dead son, even if keeping faith meant dying themselves. The storm came faster than forecast, Elias said. We thought we had time. Thought we could make it up, pay our respects, make it back down before the worst hit. But the roads. He shook his head. You know the rest. Marcus did. He saw it clearly now, the moment their tires lost purchase, the sickening slide toward the edge, the desperate seconds of knowing they were going over and being unable to stop it, the miracle of the trees catching them, the hours of cold, the choice Elias made to give Clara his coat. All of it driven by love and duty and the kind of promise that didn't bend just because circumstances got hard. I need to tell you something, Marcus said, the words coming before he decided to speak them. Both Elias and Clara looked at him, waiting. I lost someone too, in Afghanistan. His name was Daniel Roar. Everyone called him Roar. He was my spotter, my friend, my brother. We'd served together for 3 years. There was an IED, I was running point, he was covering rear. The blast. Marcus stopped, his throat closing. Koda lifted his head, pressing against his leg. I lived. He didn't. And for 2 years I've been trying to figure out why. Why I survived when better men didn't. Clara's hand reached out, covering his. Her touch was light, papery, but steady. There's no answer to that question, Marcus. Believe me, we've asked it about James for 20 years. Why him? Why our boy? Why not someone else's son? But here's what we learned, Elias added. You don't survive for no reason. You survive to carry something forward. To honor what was lost by doing something with what remains. Marcus looked at Koda, whose amber eyes looked back with that infinite patience. James wanted to rescue a retired military working dog, he said slowly. Wanted to give one a good home. He did, Clara confirmed. Wrote about it constantly. Said those dogs gave everything, and deserved to be loved when the war was done. Koda's never had a good home, Marcus admitted. Not really. He's had me and I've been running for 2 years. Just driving, just moving, just trying to outrun everything I couldn't fix. He met Clara's eyes. But 3 days ago, he stopped running long enough to save you. Both of you. And maybe, Maybe that's what James would have wanted. Not just a dog in a comfortable house, but a dog still serving, still saving lives, still showing up when he's needed. Elias smiled. A real smile this time, not dimmed by pain or cold. Then James got his wish after all. Just not the way any of us expected. The words settled into Marcus like warmth after frostbite, painful and necessary and healing all at once. Marcus stayed longer than he'd intended. An hour became 2, then 3, the winter afternoon fading into early darkness outside the hospital windows. They talked the way veterans talk, in fragments and silences, in stories that didn't need their endings explained because everyone in the room already knew how stories like that ended. Elias spoke about Korea, about cold that made this mountain blizzard look like spring weather, about friends whose names he still carried decades later. Marcus found himself talking about Afghanistan in ways he hadn't since Roar died. Not the sanitized version he gave civilians, but the real thing, the complexity of it, the brotherhood and the loss and the impossible weight of coming home when others didn't. Clara listened mostly, her hand never leaving Koda's fur, occasionally adding details about James's letters or the years after his death when the house felt too empty and too full at the same time. Empty of their son, full of his ghost. She spoke about the memorial visits, about how the first few years she and Elias would stand at the plaque and talk to James like he could hear them, and how eventually the talking gave way to silence, to just being present, to keeping the promise because keeping promises was what you did when everything else had been taken. "You understand it?" Elias said suddenly, fixing Marcus with those clear eyes that had seen too much and somehow kept looking anyway. "That's why you came back. Not to check on 2 old people you pulled off a mountain. You came back because you needed to see if the promise mattered." Marcus opened his mouth to deny it, but the words caught in his throat. Elias was right. He'd driven away from that medical station 3 days ago thinking he was done, thinking he'd fulfilled his obligation. But the emptiness that had filled his truck, even with Koda beside him, had felt heavier than before. For 2 years, he'd been driving toward nothing, running from everything, convinced that movement was the same as purpose. But saving Elias and Clara had cracked something open, had reminded him what it felt like to matter, to show up when it counted, to be the answer to a call he didn't know he'd been waiting for. "I've been running," Marcus admitted, the words coming slow and heavy. "Since I left the service. Since Roar died. I couldn't stay still because staying still meant feeling everything, and feeling everything meant drowning. So I just drove. Took contracts when I needed money, moved when I didn't, kept Koda with me because he was the only thing that didn't ask questions I couldn't answer. And now," Clara asked gently, "now I don't know." Marcus looked down at his hands, at the scars across his knuckles from a decade of close combat and hard living. "On that mountain, for the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly what I was supposed to do. Everything was clear, the mission, the objective, the execution. It made sense in a way nothing's made sense since I took off the uniform." Elias shifted in his bed, wincing slightly with the movement. "You know what the hardest part of coming home from Korea was? Not the nightmares, not the memories. It was the lack of mission. In combat, everything has purpose, your training, your position, your presence. You matter in ways that are concrete and immediate. Then you come home and suddenly you're just a person. No orders. No objective. No clear reason why you survived when others didn't." "How did you find it?" Marcus asked. "The purpose. The reason." "I stopped looking for the big answer," Elias said. "Stopped trying to figure out why I lived and my friends died. That question doesn't have an answer that satisfies. Instead, I started asking smaller questions. What can I do today? Who needs me right now? How can I honor what was lost by being present for what remains?" He reached for Clara's hand. "I found her. We built a life. We raised James. And when we lost him, we kept the promise because keeping promises was something we could do. Something concrete. Something that mattered." Marcus felt Koda's weight against his leg, solid and warm and patient. "You drove into a blizzard for a promise. And you turned around in one for a dog's instinct," Clara said. "Maybe that's what purpose looks like after war. Not grand missions or clear objectives. Just showing up when something or someone tells you to turn around." Outside, snow had started falling again. soft flakes drifting past the window like ash. Marcus watched them accumulate on the sill, thinking about all the miles he'd driven, all the roads he'd put between himself and the question Elias had named. Why did I survive? He'd been running from it for so long he'd forgotten there might be other questions worth asking. Better questions. Questions with answers you could build on instead of drown in. I don't have a home, Marcus said quietly. Haven't had one since discharge. Just the truck and whatever road comes next. Elias studied him for a long moment. Then maybe it's time to stop running long enough to find one. The words landed with the weight of an order, and Marcus felt that old instinct kick in, the need to follow command, to accept the mission, to say yes to something bigger than his own fear. Koda's tail thumped once against the floor, like the dog knew something had shifted. Some decision had been made even if Marcus didn't fully understand it yet. Stay in touch, Clara said, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. Please, you and Koda, you're part of our story now. Part of James's story. That matters to us. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. He stood to leave, Koda rising with him, and Elias's hand shot out, gripping Marcus's wrist with the same desperate strength he'd had in the hanging car, when letting go meant falling. You saved our lives, Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. But more than that, you kept our promise. You made sure we could keep showing up for our son. There's no way to repay that, but if you ever need anything, if you ever need reminding why it matters that you're still here, you call us. Understood. Yes, sir, Marcus said, and it felt like an oath. He walked out of that hospital room with Koda at his side, and for the first time in 2 years, the restlessness that drove him didn't feel like running. Felt like searching. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to find what he'd been searching for. Marcus didn't drive far. Just to a truck stop 20 miles south of the hospital, the kind of place that existed for people who lived between destinations. He parked under a flickering sodium light, killed the engine, and sat in the cab with Koda beside him while the heater ticked and cooled. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in that peculiar silence that comes after storms. Not peace exactly, but the exhausted quiet of something that's raged itself out. He couldn't stop thinking about what Clara had said, about James's letters, about the dreams James had written down in careful handwriting from a combat zone 7,000 miles from home. Dreams of the life he'd build when the war was over. A dog, partner, a brother, simple things, attainable things, things that should have been his. Marcus pulled out his phone and stared at the blank screen for a long time before he started typing. He didn't know why he was doing it, didn't know if it mattered, but the words came anyway. He searched for James's name, his unit, his memorial. Found it after a few tries. Lance Corporal James Finch, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, killed in action February 22, 2005, Fallujah, Iraq. 22 years old. There was a photo, probably from boot camp or maybe just before deployment. James smiled in it, bright and young and certain that he'd make it home because young men always believed they'd make it home. He looked like his parents. Had Clara's eyes, Elias's jawline. Had the kind of face that belonged in a yearbook or at a wedding, not on a memorial page with dates that started and ended too close together. Marcus scrolled down, reading tributes from people who'd known him, served with him, loved him. Words like brave and loyal and the best of us. The same words people had said about Roar. The same words people probably said about every young man who died before his dreams could catch up to him. The words were true, Marcus knew, but they were also insufficient. How do you compress a life, a future, an infinity of unrealized moments into a handful of adjectives and a flag folded into a triangle? Koda shifted beside him, sensing the weight of Marcus's mood the way he always did. The dog's head came up, ears forward, and Marcus felt the familiar press of Koda's muzzle against his arm. Not demanding attention, just offering presence. Just being there because there was nowhere else he'd rather be. He wanted one like you, Marcus said quietly, his voice rough in the silent cab. James. He wanted to bring home a dog like you. Give him a good life after the war. Clara said he wrote about it all the time. About the MWDs he saw in Iraq, how they worked, how loyal they were, how they deserved better than kennels and cages when their service was done. Koda's tail thumped once against the seat. He never got the chance, Marcus continued, his throat tightening. Never got to come home, never got to visit a shelter, never got to pick out a dog and bring him to a house and give him the life he'd earned. That future got stolen. IED outside Fallujah, 22 years old, and everything he was going to be just stopped. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Monday morning. Every dream about a dog who'd sleep on his bed and ride in his truck and be the brother he'd never had. All of it gone in the time it takes a pressure plate to detonate. The words hung in the air, heavy with all the things Marcus had never let himself say about Roar. Because it wasn't just James's dreams that got stolen. It was Roar's too. Roar, who'd talked about opening a bar when he got out, about teaching his kid to fish, about growing old enough to complain about his back and tell the same stories at every family gathering until people groaned at the familiar opening lines. Roar, who'd died covering Marcus's retreat, who'd bought Marcus's future with his own, who'd made a trade Marcus never asked for and couldn't repay. I got to live, Marcus said, and it sounded like a confession. I got to keep going, got to have more time, more years, more chances. And what did I do with it? I ran. For 2 years, I just ran, like if I moved fast enough I could outrun the fact that I'm here and he's not. Like motion was the same as meaning. Koda pressed closer, solid and warm against Marcus's side. But you, Marcus said, looking down at the dog who'd saved 2 lives 3 days ago without hesitation, without calculation, without asking what he'd get in return. You didn't run. When I would have driven past, you made me stop. When that couple was hanging over nothing, you went down first. You laid across their legs and kept them warm and stayed with them until they were safe. You did what we were trained to do. You showed up when it mattered. Marcus's hand found the thick fur at Koda's neck, his fingers working through the familiar texture that had grounded him through 100 moments when the weight of survival felt too heavy to carry. Clara said God sent them James's dream, but maybe you've been living his dream all along. Not the quiet retirement he imagined, not the peaceful life in some house with a yard, but the heart of it, being a partner, being a brother, being exactly where you're needed when you're needed there. That's what James wanted. That's what those MWDs he wrote about gave him in Iraq. And that's what you gave his parents when everything else had been taken. The truck stop's lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in sodium yellow relief. A semi pulled in, its engine a low rumble that faded as the driver killed it. The world kept moving, kept turning, indifferent to the weight of stolen dreams and survivors' guilt and all the futures that ended before they began. But Marcus sat in his truck with his dog pressed against his side, and for the first time since Roar died, he let himself feel it. All of it. The grief and the gratitude and the guilt and the grace of still being here, still breathing, still capable of matching to someone. He felt the dreams that had been stolen, from James and Roar and every brother who'd run out of time. And he felt the impossible gift of the dreams he still had left, the future he'd been running from instead of running toward. We're going back, Marcus said finally, the decision settling into him like an anchor finding bottom. Tomorrow, we're going back to see them before they're discharged. And I'm going to tell Elias yes. Koda's tail thumped twice, steady as a heartbeat, and Marcus almost smiled.